Hey y'all, I'm here with Keri Blakinger, author of Corrections in Ink, which is an absolutely incredible read, and I now have an autograph copy, of which I'm very grateful. So this is going on the shelf, and it's an autograph advance copy. So
yes, this is rare. He has a soft cover. It's called an ART, advanced review copy. There are not that many of them.
So this is kind of like the Joe DiMaggio card that nobody else has. So I'm holding this, and when you get really, really famous, I'm selling it. I'm sorry.
But you know what this means you didn't get? So in the actual hardcover versions, the first inset page is black. It's all black. Oh. So I sign it normally with a gold shiny pen. So I couldn't do that here because there's no point. It's white paper. It'll bleed through anyway.
Okay.
You'll have to get a hard copy too.
Well, yeah, I'll just get a bunch of copies. So I met Keri because you did an NBC paired story about prison TikTokers or people doing prison social media. And you highlighted a bunch of people and somebody put me in contact with you and we had like an hour and a half phone call. And it was just like...
Yeah. I was pacing in the parking lot outside my apartment. I remember it.
Yeah, and I met, I'd never met her before. I didn't know anything about her except the little stuff I'd looked up online. But I was like, hey, I like this person. I want to know who she is. And sure enough, a couple months later, we ended up in Pennsylvania on a random...
Hanover, Pennsylvania.
And now, 6 months after that, we're in Houston. So I just wanted to talk about the work you do because I feel like it's incredible and it's empowering. Because I remember when I was inside, one of the biggest things I felt was I felt disempowered. I felt unseen. I felt unheard. Felt like nobody outside cared. So when these abuses happened, it just we accepted them. We'd gotten to the point where we assumed everything would continue to happen the way it was. And then all of a sudden, I ran into a reporter who made me feel like I was seen. And you chose what career path?
Journalism.
Okay. So tell me about your career path. I mean, you got out of New York State prison when?
2012.
Okay.
It's been a while.
And now you're going to work at the LA Times? And
I am.
That's a big jump in 10 years.
Yeah, so I started, when I got out, I started off with whatever the fuck I could find on Craigslist. So I don't know if I've ever told you this. So I was writing trivia questions for a Korean trivia site.
Yeah.
And I was also writing articles about locksmithing. I don't know fuck all about locksmithing, but it was some locksmith that was keeping a blog to try to drive traffic to their site, and they had hired someone to hire a person to do all these articles. I wrote 500 articles about locksmithing. So I in theory knew how to pick locks really well by the end of that, but I couldn't do it in practice. And I did that for those kinds of things for a year, and then somebody that I used to get high with called me and was like, hey, I have a friend who's an editor and she's looking to write about people who went through the local jail. And, I think you guys would get along, but she come interview you. So she drove out to where I was in the middle of nowhere, which is 45 minutes from any, decent sized, town or city. And she interviewed me. And then afterwards she was like, hey, I Googled some of the stuff you wrote. I think she meant stuff I'd written in college before I gotten arrested.
Korean trivia questions?
No. I used to write for the college newspaper when I was in college before I got arrested. And she was like, I Googled, some what you wrote. It's good. You want to try writing for us? So this was covering town board meetings in a town with 3,000 or 4,000 people. So it was 3-4 hour meetings about the size of the next salt barn and backyard chicken ordinances and this kind of shit. And there would be no spectators or 2 spectators and 6 old white guys that were the board members, or 5 old white guys, I guess. And I would sit through these board meetings and write articles for $40. And that was my first freelance job in journalism. And then she hired me full time, which again, that was $21,000. So I was not starting off glamorous. And they didn't even they didn't even reimburse for mileage.
So you basically made $7,000 a year because you had to drive.
But I'd just been used to prison wages of 16 cents an hour, so I was like, I'm fucking rich. 21,000 a year, hell yeah! But I was also living in a really expensive area because there were so many colleges around where I was in upstate New York. But after a couple years of that, I then got in a very entry-level job at the New York Daily News. Just writing listicles and and breaking news. It seems like a big jump from the Ithaca Times to the New York Daily News, but the Daily News was at that point looking to hire a team of really cheap young reporters that could just churn out stuff that they thought would generate traffic. I mean, I guess it did generate traffic. I wrote some ridiculous shit there. Mm-hmm. I wrote a story about I wrote one that was a listicle about 6 worst things that can happen to your penis. My favorite part of that was
What's the worst?
I think there's something that can happen to it that's like saxophone dick. Like it's some fucking STD that goes wrong and it looks like a saxophone. Um,
Oh wow.
those are pretty bad. But then I also did one on like, 8 fetishes that are actually real.
Oh no.
Oh my god, this was so wild. So I ended up. Some people have a sexual attraction to like having sex with chickens. Okay, so I am interviewing a sex expert about all these kinks. Okay, in a newsroom where we were packed in, sitting like almost shoulder to shoulder. I had the seat right next to my boss. I am fairly certain that he put me next to him, knowing that like this bitch been to prison. She's gonna have some crazy shit to say. Like this was our joke. That was why he had the seating chart that way, because it was not alphabetical. It made no sense. Like, but he put me next to him, and that was our the rest of us joked about that. And I'm on the phone listening to this guy tell me how like, well, the thing about having sex with the chicken is you have to sacrifice the chicken. Like, obviously, the chicken's going to die was his point. And I'm like repeating things back as I'm typing it. And my boss had turned bright red. He was laughing so hard. So this is to say, this was a fun job, but like not fulfilling, like obviously. But it was a great step in like career wise. Like it could show that I could work for a large national outlet and carry a lot of weight, like do a lot of stories. Like I had to write like 6 or 7 stories a day. So, I think it was a good career move, although I now have some weird clips if you Google like my name.
Also, I mean, how big was that change from a small town in upstate New York to being in New York City to working to busy, crazy?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big change. I think I definitely would have done it differently going back. But I mean, I think I would have just like looked. There's things I just didn't know about, like looking for, where's actually the best place to live,
Okay.
like I would have done more research about like what neighborhood to live in and things like that. Like, and to be clear, not that I had only lived in the country prior to that. I had lived in northern New Jersey prior to that, but I was not working in New York at that point. And I had been in college, which is very different, obviously, because you have like a sort of guaranteed friend group in college. Like you're going to live with a bunch of people in your age range, Um, God, when I was at that job at the Daily News, I had the weirdest landlord. I lived above a bootleg costume shop. Okay, this guy would he would rent out. You know how there's all those like characters in Times Square, right?
Mm-hmm.
He would rent out costumes for people like that. So he would rent out like Minnie and Barney and things like that. But like those are copyrighted. And he didn't like have permissions. These were like bootleg Barney costumes, and he would occasionally get paranoid that like ABC was gonna come sue him, and he would like be like, "Yeah, I cut this costume up into little pieces and deposited in dumpsters all over town." It was so weird. But anyways, that was an interesting place to live.
Okay, so you did the New York Daily News. You went from listicles, and then where was the jump after that?
I went to the Houston Chronicle because I realized the Daily News at that point was, the New York Post always called us a teetering tabloid, which is true. It was very unstable. Like, I think 4 months in, 20 of the people I had gotten hired with got laid off. And I was like, fuck, I have to get out of here. Like, you'd come in, if one of the bosses wore a tie to work, you'd be like, oh, that's it. They're shutting down the whole paper today. They dressed up nice to fire us. So I applied to a fellowship for Hearst. Hearst owns like papers in Connecticut and some in California and San Antonio and Houston. And I applied for this 2-year fellowship, and the first placement I got was in Houston at the Houston Chronicle. And I ended up staying there, and I was there for 3.5 years. And I, in that time, transitioned from doing like general assignment news to specifically covering prisons. My editor at the time was like, hey, our death penalty reporter just retired. Do you want to take some of that over? And that was just going to be like a side beat. Like it's a decent amount of your job in a place like Texas because there's such an active execution chamber. But it was not like a full job. And then I sort of expanded from covering death row to covering prisons. And then in the course of that, realized that this was something I was actually really good at, because I think I just came into it with a different set of like beliefs and understandings about that whole world. And I think that people were more willing to trust me, like people who did time, people who were on the inside. I think even staff, just because they knew that I understood that world, And so I covered prisons for a couple years, and then I got hired at the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit news outlet. I liken it to ProPublica. I say it's like the ProPublica, but of criminal justice. So we just cover criminal justice, and I still focused on prisons and prosecutors and the death penalty a lot. And I was there from the start of 2020 until the end of this week.
Well, and the Marshall Project was the first publication that published one of my pieces from inside and paid me. And I got a check from the Marshall Project in prison, and I was like, woo, I made it. That's amazing.
It's so funny. They make it so hard to pay people. Because like in Texas now, they've changed the rules so that you can't just, like the Marshall Project can't just pay someone. Like they have to pay their loved one or something. Because you can only have like 10 certified people or whatever that can put money on your books.
Yeah.
I think they said they were hoping that it would cut down on like
drugs
drug
and
trade.
Contraband.
Yeah.
How is that working?
Based on all of the footage I'm getting from people with contraband cell phones, I'm going to say it's not working out well.
Pretty good point. Okay, so you left the Marshall Project, or leaving the Marshall Project at the end of this week?
Yes, and then I'm going to the Los Angeles Times.
So, I mean, again, in basically 10 years, you went from small town New York, living in a trailer, like hoping to get a Craigslist thing to write Korean trivia.
I wasn't actually living in a trailer.
Okay.
It was not great, but it was not a trailer.
But I mean, that's an amazing accomplishment, and all of your work has been about telling other people's stories. It hasn't been like, hey, look at me, I want to do this. Right. You're telling other people's stories. You're giving people voices that don't have them. You've told me some stories about death row that literally left me just in tears. Some of the interactions and the people you met. So like, what was the most memorable thing? What was the thing that you're most proud of from that experience?
I think probably the denture stories. Yeah. So I wrote a few stories in, I guess, 2018. I had been investigating, I'd interviewed someone who couldn't get dentures on Texas death row. And as I started poking into why he couldn't get dentures, I discovered this was a broader issue in Texas. And it was wild to me because in New York prisons, I saw women around me getting dentures. If you didn't have teeth, they would give you dentures. Mm-hmm. And they don't do that in Texas. If you didn't have teeth, they would literally take your food, put it in a blender, puree it, pour it in a cup, and serve it to you that way.
Okay, was this just for death row or all across Texas?
It turned out to be for all across Texas.
I mean, that's insane. And I want a lot of people to know. People think, oh, well, death row, they're going to be put to death anyways. What is the average length of stay on death row?
It's around 20 years at this point.
So 20 years without
dentures. And that's
dentures.
not just in Texas. That's nationally. It fluctuates a little. Some years it's 19. Some years it's like 21 or so. But it's been around 20 years is the average length of time between sentencing and execution.
So 20 years for people who are on death row, and then people who are getting out, people who have life sentences, not getting dentures at all, just giving blended food. So What happened with this?
So I wrote that first story, and then afterwards, there was one particular lawmaker who was really incensed by it, and he pressured the prison system to change. And so they bought a 3D printer and started 3D printing dentures. And they did that for several years. And then I got a tip a couple months ago, actually, that they'd stopped doing the 3D dentures. And I was pretty pissed. Like I was just like why would you just stop providing a basic body part? But then they said that they were going to start a new dentures program and make dentures more widely available to people. And they actually announced some of their goals in their 2030 plan last week. And one of them is to expand dentures availability, because even when they got the 3D printer, they made like several hundred dentures. I guess it might have gone over 1,000, but in a prison system with 120,000 people, there are far more people that needed dentures than ever got them. They were trying to prioritize based on like specific medical criteria. And then they expanded it, I think, to include like diabetics or something. But, they had like specific high needs medical people that would get them. And most people didn't get them still. So, now they're saying that they're going to expand it, and that's part of their 2030 plan. So hopefully this will be one of the last stories I write before I leave Texas. Although at the moment, they are refusing to tell me any details about it. So I'm literally at this point going to end up writing a story that is like, Texas is planning to do a great thing, but they are refusing to release any information about it. Like, it's so wild to me that even when prisons do a good thing, they manage to like fuck it up somehow. So it's still going to be basically a bad story about how you won't be transparent about what's going on behind the walls, as usual.
Jeez. There's one other
I'm
story.
always down.
No, but there's one other story you told me that literally left me like shaking and in tears. You were talking about the man who they kind of like took from him the very last thing that he had was even his faith.
I was talking about John Ramirez. And so I've been working on this documentary over the past year. And it's about this guy, John Ramirez, who was on death row in Texas for a crime that was like 13, 14 years ago. And he ended up killing a convenience store clerk, Pablo Castro. And so when I visited him the first time, it was a week before he was supposed to be executed in 2021. And I was there because he had an appeal at that point that was getting a decent amount of traction and that I was going to write about, because he had found God while he was in prison. Like, he'd been religious some before, but like, he really came into his faith in the years that he was in prison. And, I went to interview him because his appeal was that he wanted his chaplain to be able to lay hands on him and pray out loud as he was being executed. And the Texas prison system would not allow that. They said it would interfere with the execution, which is a lethal injection. So it's not like we're talking about an electrocution where like there's some chance of the current, like whatever. But no, this is just a lethal injection, and they just didn't want him to be touched, which was kind of wild because prison chaplains have been for decades allowed to lay hands on people as they're being executed. So there's really no reason to ban someone's personal chaplain, he's Baptist, from laying hands on him. And I was writing about this, appeal, and it had been one in a series of appeals from other prisoners who were trying to get more access to religion in their last moments. And so I went and interviewed him, and he spent about a third of the time talking about his faith. He spent like maybe a third of the time talking about this radio station that they'd started on death row that the guys could participate in. And, he was so, he had such a clear vision for what his faith meant to him and like what he thought the afterlife would be like. And he was so confident that he was going to get a say. And I was like, this man is delusional. Like in this Supreme Court, like, I did not think he would get a stay. And, the night before, he went out and gave this, they let him have a rare first time ever, like, church service in the outdoor rec yard. Because normally death row inmates are in solitary constantly in Texas. And that time they let him go out into one of the little dog kennels in the rec yard, and the choir was in another dog kennel. They like sang to him, and he gave this really moving speech to them. And to me, it was, what I thought was so moving about it was that although it was recorded for the prison's internal radio station, this is fundamentally a speech that he thought he was just giving to other prisoners. Like, he had no reason to believe that I would end up listening to it, or that someone on the outside would end up listening to it. And the sincerity and the way he talks about his faith, and the way he talks about his regrets, and how and his remorse, and what a bad person he thinks he had been previously. It all seemed so sincere to me, in part because this is a thing, as a reporter, you never get to see about death row, or as anyone in the public. You don't get to see how they talk to each other when they think no one's listening. And to hear that sincerity, even in that context, the day before he expects to be killed, was, I thought that stood out to me. And then, he did get a stay. On the day that he was supposed to be executed, he did get a stay. And I was shocked. But then, afterwards, the reason he got a stay was that the Supreme Court wanted to give time to consider that claim and see if the chaplain could touch him. So afterwards, I started working on a documentary on it. And then in early spring, there was a letter written by several district attorneys saying, hey, we don't believe in the death penalty anymore. One of the ones that signed on was the Nueces County district attorney. That's where his case was out of. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I wonder if they're going to set another execution date on this guy, or did he actually just completely avoid execution? And then a month after that, the Supreme Court decided in his favor. They said, hey, you can have that, chaplain touching you while you're being executed, which is cool. He won, but also it means now he can be executed.
Mm.
And then shortly after that, the district attorney asked for the district attorney's office asked for an execution date in his case. And I was shocked, and I called a PR person who'd been dealing with them, and I was like, hey, why is that? Like, this is confusing. This person doesn't believe in the death penalty, says they're going to work to end it, but they just set an execution date. And it turned out the district attorney, like one of his lieutenants, had just done it, and he didn't mean to. And so then he went and like tried to get the date retracted, and the judge said, I actually don't have the jurisdiction to do this. Like, the way the law is written, I can't just cancel a date unless there's specific reasons. So it ended up that, like, the defense and the prosecution did not want this execution to go through, but it ended up, there was no way to cancel it, it turned out. And I think all of that, and just the number of years he'd been living in solitary at that point, like, really, I think that really wore on him. And at some point, in one of the times that I was visiting him for an interview, like, I noticed he was like a little bit depressed, and I thought it was because he'd, like, because he was going to get executed, and because it was, I think, such a tease to have the district attorney not want you executed, but yet nobody can stop this thing. And then, the next time he was also, he was still quite depressed. And he started talking about, like, sort of, oh, you just live and then you die and that's all there is to it. And I was so struck by what a sharp contrast that had been to a year prior, when he had this robust vision of an afterlife, and now he was just talking about how he wanted there to be blackness and he hoped there was no afterlife. And he was calling me a lot during this time as well. He was, he had someone else he was calling, and it was a third party call. And I mean, obviously that's against the rules, but he's no longer alive, so I don't think that's really a concern. But I was hearing it. I was hearing him lose faith. And he said in the end that, like, he still believed in God, but he just hoped that there was no afterlife. I am not a person of faith. Like, this is not a thing that, like, that resonates with me in that way. But what resonated with me was watching someone go from being just so full of hope, even in such dire circumstances, to such a black place that he just wanted blackness. And watching that happen over a period of weeks, and hearing it in his voice, and doing these interviews and seeing him again and again saying these things, that I think that was one of the darkest things that I've seen on death row. I think that one of the things we tell ourselves in prison is that, you can at the core, you can control your own beliefs. That is a thing they can't take from you. How you view yourself, how you view the world, and, what you believe, what your faith is. And it felt like, in the end, he lost even that, or like the system took that from him. And, and he was executed. He was executed this past fall.
As dark as that is, the fact that you're there to tell that story that nobody would ever know otherwise, it's just a powerful thing. I think it talks about our ideas of punishment and our ideas of justice and our ideas of, like, how we want to treat people in the world, both the best of people and the worst of people. So I'm grateful for what you do, and I'm grateful for those stories. And I feel, like, genuinely inspired on a regular basis, as well as, like, more in contact with my own humanity based on the work you do. So
thank you. Yeah, one of the other things is, now that we're a few months past it, like, some of the victims' family has been, talking to us for this documentary, and some have not. And, one of the things that I think is hard for a lot of, a lot of people that are sort of watching this or that are around this to reconcile is like having compassion or sympathy for people who are on the row as well as for the victims and their families. And I think in the documentary, I think we do a pretty good job of honoring both of those things. But one thing I've noticed is whenever I tell these stories, there's a lot of viewers that will comment on like, "What about the victim's family?" And like, um, it's sort of hard in an interview or in a TikTok or a short video to really honor all of those sides of things at once. But I just want to make sure to always say that I'm cognizant of that. And I think about, all of the people around this. And some of them didn't want to talk to us. Some of them don't want to relive that again and again.
Sure.
Some of them just don't want to be public about it. And I understand all of that. And so I just want to make sure to say for viewers that when I tell these stories, it's not that I'm unaware that there are these other rings of trauma around it, but I do think it's important to sort of highlight the ways in which the trauma is the concentric rings of trauma that emanate from the death penalty are not just the places you would think they are. Like it's predictable. I think that the victim's family would be traumatized and have their lives forever changed. One of the things that was a takeaway for me from doing this documentary, I actually should. I think I have some of the raw footage I can show you later. Um, is there's this woman, Jan. She's a very nice lady, and she lives in Corpus Christi, and she's a like old white Republican, and very religious, and just not the person you would expect. Like she had previously been very pro death penalty, not the person you would expect to befriend someone like John Ramirez, and go visit him like a couple times a month. And like, she was writing all these letters to him and stuff. And, over time became one of his closest friends. And in the day before the execution, her last visit to him, we had, we were there with her outside the prison and, had got some of this on camera. And she went in to visit him and she came out, and in that time was when they realized that like he definitely like lost his last appeal and he was definitely going to be executed. Or I think the parole board had definitely turned him down. That might have been what it was. I don't remember at that point. And just the way, like watching her sob in the car like that, like her grief shook the car. Like it was like the minivan was shaking. And I can't even do justice in describing it, but I so hope that when people see that clip that they understand that everybody that touches the death penalty ends up being traumatized. And I'm not saying that as an activist. I'm just saying that I don't think the death penalty does the things we think it does in the way we think it does them.
Sure.
So again, dark and depressing as always.
Enlightening and powerful and genuine. Thank you, Keri.